Morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of the conference organizers, Atiya Ahmed, Elizabeth Anker, Ari Dubnov, Shayna Marshall, and myself, good morning and welcome to the 17th Annual Conference of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at GW. First, I'd like to acknowledge that GW is located on land long tended by Anacostan and Piscataway people. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal of Indigenous people from this territory, and that these nations ceded significant portions of their lands in inequitable and unfair treaties with the US government. We recognize and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. Addressing historical injustices does not end with this acknowledgement, but with ongoing commitment and work that involves all of us. I'm Mona Ateya, Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and Associate Professor of Geography and International Affairs here at the Elliott School. The Institute for Middle East Studies' mission is to foster a vibrant intellectual community through facilitating research and dialogue on the modern Middle East, supporting faculty and graduate students in all departments of the university whose research interests support the region, and supporting educational programs, including a BA and MA in Middle East. Through public programming based on informed scholarship, IMIS cultivates a deeper understanding and appreciation of events, ideas, and cultures of the region in order to produce a better informed public. Moments like this underscore the importance of this mission and our collective responsibility in advancing it. We are gathered here today to discuss Middle East knowledge production in the aftermath of October 7th. While the level of death, suffering, and destruction witnessed on that day and over the course of the past 7 months cannot be overstated, today's conference focuses not on the war itself, but on its impact on knowledge, production, and education. With nearly 90% of all school buildings, including major universities in Gaza, damaged or destroyed, the killing of over 450 academic and administrative staff, including 3 university professors, 7 deans, and at least 64 professors, the United Nations asserted yesterday that it is reasonable to ask if this constitutes scholasticide, or the systematic obliteration of education through arrest, detention, or killing of teachers, students, and staff, and the destruction of educational infrastructure with far-reaching implications for the long-term future of Palestinian learning and society. But beyond that, and much closer to home, we are witnessing an unprecedented acceleration in intimidation, harassment, doxing, and silencing of students and faculty on university campuses that constitute an assault on academic freedom, while university administrators largely protect the interest of donors over their own. Palestine Legal reports that between October 7, 2023 and February 13, 2024, they received an unprecedented 1,300 reports from people targeted for Palestine advocacy. And in the past 3 days alone, we have seen Professor Jody Dean, distinguished political theorist at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, placed on leave for an essay she penned, over 100 students arrested on the campus of Columbia University, and the arrest of scholar and activist Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian at her home in Jerusalem. The attack on academic freedom is both near and far, and unfortunately has only just begun. This conference was organized to give space for us to reflect on the long-term implications of October 7th on academic freedom, Middle East studies, knowledge production practices, and broader public discourses, both here and abroad. And to help us with that today, we are very fortunate to have respected scholars who have given generously of their time in a time when so many demands are being placed on them. As you see in the program, which are over in that corner if you haven't grabbed one, we have 3 panels for today, and each presenter will present for 12 minutes, and the discussant will offer some reflections in the first round of questions, and then we'll have time for the audience to ask questions of the panelists. We will end the day with a brief discussion of ongoing initiatives and resources for safeguarding academic freedom. For the question and answer portion of today, we are trying something new suggested by Eve Tuck, Professor of Indigenous Studies at NYU, as a way to be more deliberate and thoughtfully engage with one another. So during the first 5 minutes of the question and answer session, we ask the audience to please turn to the person sitting next to them and do a peer review of their question to ensure the question is actually a question and not a statement or a personal anecdote, and to ensure we are not asking the speaker to do something that is beyond their capacity or outside the purview of their topic or expertise. Thank you so much for joining us in this experiment. And for those of you who are online, the IMIS Operation Manager, Christian Clinton, soon to be Assistant Director, will be fielding your questions through the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. Finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues who carefully crafted this conference, Ari, Atia, Libby, and Shayna, and to also thank the IMA staff, Christian Clinton, Shayna Marshall, and of course our dedicated work study students, Asya, Ellie, Matthew, and Adelena, and Noha, who made today's event possible and have helped with all of the logistics. Thank you so much for your contributions. So with that, I will hand the floor to the chair of our first panel, Dr. Shay Hazkani, who's our IMA Sabbatical Fellow this year and Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland. The panel is entitled Safe to Teach, Academic Freedom in the Age of Precarity and Censorship. Thank you so much for joining us.
We ask all the panelists to join us already?
Yes, please, thank you.
Do that. So if we can all. Good to see you. Hello, everyone. My name is Shay Hazkani. I'm a fellow here at the Institute for Middle East Studies, normally at the University of Maryland. Welcome to our first panel, Safe to Teach, Academic Freedom in the Age of Precarity and Censorship. Now, all panel chairs since the dawn of academic panels have said that their panels is very timely. They have all been lying. However, this panel is indeed very timely. Let me start by acknowledging the shameful arrest of in Israel of Professor Nadia Shalhoub-Kevorkian yesterday after a campaign against her academic freedom and free speech, which was led by the leadership of her own institution, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I'm sure all of us on this panel call for her immediate release, as well as dropping all the spurious charges against her. If this turn toward fascism or McCarthyism in Israel was long time in the coming and should perhaps not surprise us as much, the one on US campuses is more worrisome. Just in the past 48 hours, we've seen dozens of students get arrested for calling to free Palestine. And we also saw university presidents and administrators, for lack of other words, and it is early in the morning, throw their faculty and students under the bus in congressional hearings right here around the corner. And we know that, not far from us on K Street, H Street, elsewhere, pressure and lobby groups are working very diligently to make the federal government adopt the definition of anti-Semitism that will include anti-Zionism. Now, that's not to say that anti-Semitism, along with other forms of racism like anti-Palestinianism, is not real on campuses. It is. But together with the rise in anti-Semitism, there's a massive rise in the weaponization of anti-Semitism. That is the use of the claim of anti-Semitism to shut down conversation about Palestine, Israel, and at this particular juncture on the onslaught on Gaza, described by the International Court of Justice as a plausible genocide that followed the heinous attacks by Hamas on Israeli communities on October 7. Now, we know already from things like BDS laws in several dozen states that what starts in the first act as something about Palestine, Israel, often comes back in the second and third act of the so-called show as laws that curtail many other civil liberties. One example, of course, is the forbidding of boycott of companies engaged in fossil fuels, and many other such examples. Now, to talk about where we are joined by four distinguished panelists: Aslı, Bâli from Yale University, Bassam Haddad from George Mason University, Negar Razavi from Princeton University, and our discussant, Judith Tucker from Georgetown University. You can read their full biographies in the handouts as well as online. Each panelist will speak for about 12 minutes, and I'll help keep the time. Then we'll go to the Q&A. Thank you. We'll start with Aslı.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. Is this on? Okay, great. So there's almost nothing left to say because Shay decided to cover it all in his opening remarks. But nonetheless, let's try to see what we can launch into. I'm currently serving as the president of the Middle East Studies Association, as some of you may know. I'm not here speaking on behalf of MESA at all, but the experience of being president in this year has really deeply informed my understanding of the patterns that we're seeing across the country in terms of academic freedom. And just as a personal anecdote, before becoming president, I served for almost, I think, 15 years in the Committee on Academic Freedom. There's a very active advocacy approach in MESA on the questions of academic freedom. I served on the Middle East North Africa wing of that committee. So it's split into a committee on academic freedom in North America for those who study the Middle East and North America, and then a committee for the Middle East and North Africa that focus on violations of academic freedom, abrogations of the autonomy of higher education, ways in which students have been targeted, including by governments as well as their own universities. And that MENA wing was extraordinarily active over those 15 years. We would typically write a volume of letters that would be triple or quadruple what the North American wing was producing. Understandably, we were covering many more countries. I myself was focused on research on Turkey, and we alone probably in some years produced triple, quadruple, all that was produced in the North America wing. Obviously, that has been completely inverted in this year. Now it is the North America wing, and I invite you to look at our advocacy page. You'll see material on Jodi Dean as an example. On the MENA wing, you'll see our interventions for Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian, whose arrest, as Shay just said, follows on a deliberate campaign of defamation and pressure by her own university, which in fact engendered these accusations that she now faces. The university stood down, but its allies in government stood up. And we've been seeing something very comparable on the US side. It's just really worth pausing to see that inversion for what it is, because this country, which speaks in platitudes about freedom of speech and academic freedom and the right to education, and purports to offer tutelary advice to other countries, has now become truly the heart of the most repressive campus climate environment that, we have seen in a generation. And it builds on, of course, earlier right-wing attacks on higher education, populist attacks on so-called elites, and so forth, so that we see a convergence of an already existing right-wing campaign against diversity, equity, inclusion, against critical race teaching, against LGBTQ inclusion, now being supercharged by the pretextual manipulation of anti-discrimination law in the name of engendering this kind of repression and essentially suppressing dissident voices or forms of opposition on our own campuses and across the country that the reigning political climate disavows. Okay, so having said that, what are the patterns of censorship we're actually seeing? I recognize that I've already spent much of my time with a throat clearing exercise. We have seen everything from racial profiling and hate crimes on our campuses, including, of course, most famously, the shooting of 3 students in Vermont who were wearing keffiyehs, and selective enforcement of rules, prior restraint on events, disciplining of students and faculty. Again, most recently, we heard a university president proudly proclaim to Congress her intention to discipline faculty, remove them from chair positions of committees, and then return to her campus to have 100 of her students arrested, violating norms against the invitation of the police, to break up a nonviolent encampment as a political exercise of free speech on a campus. We've seen universities engage in forms of direct censorship, the canceling of events and screenings of films. We've seen them ban student organizations, and in the name of anti-Semitism, of combating anti-Semitism, banning student organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace. We've seen universities prohibit language and words in the United States. We have lists being produced of words like intifada that are deemed verboten on campuses because they create a climate of alleged intimidation, a circumstance in which one can only expect that the use of any word in the Arabic language could be mistaken for a campaign of intimidation and in need of policing, calling into question our endeavor altogether. What is it to study the Middle East and work on the Middle East when language itself can be precluded from, English language fora? And we've received reports of instances in which university and college leadership have infringed academic freedom more directly by intervening in syllabi and curricular choices by faculty and shaping pedagogy and reaching into the classroom to determine what may or may not be taught. The chilling effect of all of these actions, of course, is incredibly real and means that whatever individual instances we collect, whatever statistics we describe, fail to capture the actual picture of what's happening because it doesn't include all the people who choose not to speak, choose not to screen, choose not to organize, choose not to publish as a consequence of the climate reigning on their campuses. We do have legal protections in this country, and as a law professor, I feel called upon to say a few words just about what that means and how we can, if at all, use it. So there are two different bodies that are oftentimes conflated. There's the set of laws and rules that govern freedom of speech, and then separately, there's the body of rules around academic freedom, which also have a legal and constitutional underpinning. These are both related to the First Amendment, but they're different aspects of what it means to protect speech. So, of course, at public universities in the United States, there's a requirement to abide by the First Amendment because they are an extension of state government. And this means that there is a right to engage in political speech on campuses in writing and verbally. There's a right to demand neutrality as to viewpoints. So viewpoint discrimination is impermissible at public universities, and that speech can only be limited in circumstances where there's a threat of immediate harm. There are rules that allow the regulation of the time, manner, and location of speech in a public setting. But apart from that, there are no permissible restrictions in the absence of a threat of violence. This is not coterminous with what academic freedom means. Academic freedom is a set of protections for faculty, scholars, and researchers to enable them to pursue research and ideas, even when they may be unpopular, in the service of advancing knowledge and scholarship. And so it's essentially tied to a professional and vocational understanding of what our purpose is at a university and how that purpose is connected to educating citizens in a democracy. These are even broader sets of goals and broader sets of constitutional protections. And they mean that there should be protections in the classroom, which extend to pedagogical choices that faculty make, that when scholars engage in extramural speech, their universities should be protecting their right to draw on their expertise to make statements that intervene in public debates, and that these activities too must be enabled by the university's rule because they enable scholars to provide insights that inform the public in a circumstance of public debate. That failing to protect the right of faculty members to say controversial things in public suggests a willingness to police speech rather than and substitute for those authorities in the government that are endowed with the power to oversee the implementation of the First Amendment, to replace them with a policing environment on campuses that essentially is the opposite of what academic freedom is meant to protect, but also what the scholarly endeavor is meant to be. Turning free speech into broader protection that we all enjoy as rights holders is essential on our campuses to remind ourselves that we're not just engaged in the academic and educational exercise, but also we're citizens in this country and we're citizens on our campuses. Our students are, we don't yield those rights when we come onto a campus. And as a consequence, even when there is pressure from external actors, including donors, alums, and most recently Congress, we actually have rights. Congress, interestingly, has the ability to investigate. They can subpoena individuals to come speak to them. They can't engage in enforcement. They can't engage in criminalization of speech. They can create a frightening climate that produces the same effects. And we have to remind ourselves that we are rights holders, including when the government infringes those rights. That's actually what the First Amendment is for. It's a restraint on government actors from infringing on the rights of those who speak. What we are witnessing is a universe in which government actors, hand in glove with right-wing private sector actors and highly motivated, ideologically partisan donors, are creating an environment that is precisely the one the First Amendment is designed to restrict. And we need to call upon it. And we need to take the offensive and assert our rights rather than capitulating in the face of this kind of pressure. Now, I've already mentioned the ways in which anti-discrimination law has been weaponized in this context as one of the many mechanisms for restraining speech. And by this, I mean pretextual claims of anti-Semitism. I want to share Shai's opening comment, which is that, of course, there are real instances of anti-Semitism and also real instances of anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism on our campuses, and these have all increased. But there is also a desire to expand the definition of anti-Semitism to encompass disfavored political views, anti-Zionism, and indeed more than anti-Zionism. You don't have to be anti-Zionist to commit to being an advocate for Palestinian rights, but being an advocate for Palestinian rights today is mistaken for acts of anti-Semitism. And to find evidence of this, you need look no further than the ADL's most recent grading of campuses supposedly on anti-Semitism and their so-called heat map, and look to see what are the incidents that are being coded as anti-Semitic incidents. Can we even grade those incidents as anti-Zionist, let alone anti-Semitist? No, anti-Semitic. No, in most cases, what you see are assertions of Palestinian rights, wearing sartorial choices that represent solidarity, all of them being described as the creation of an anti-Semitic climate. Resisting the definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is important, but more important is naming these strategies for what they are, whether they're happening through campus speech codes or they're happening in Congress, to express clearly why it is that we reject this conflation, which flattens diversity within the Jewish community, broadens anti-Semitism to the point that the definition becomes empty, and it becomes impossible to actually distinguish between meaningful instances of discriminatory conduct and legitimate protected speech acts. I want to say, and I have just 1 minute to say this, that this focus on anti-Semitism has led some on campuses to say, what about Islamophobia? What about anti-Muslim racism? These are not the right moves, in my view, because for starters, they endorse a sacralization of the underlying conflict as one between Muslims and Jews, and they suggest that there's some kind of parallel in which necessarily all persons that are critical of Israel or supportive of Palestinian rights are somehow not Jewish. In fact, they're somehow allied with the Muslim community as a whole. And on the other side, all Jewish people are somehow the victims of a form of discrimination on the basis of their support for Israel. This is entirely false. It's a false framing of both the conflict and of the speech environment that we're navigating. People of all faith backgrounds are expressing their political views. Oftentimes people of great diversity, but disproportionately people of color, their political views in support of Palestinian rights, and reducing their protection to protection against Islamophobia is simply mystification. And it serves propagandistic purposes, in my view, even as we must be vigilant against anti-Muslim racism, of course, and anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism when we see it. All right, so that's me telling myself that I'm done. I'm going to take maybe 10 more seconds to say one of the challenges we face, and I mentioned this in the context of referencing the ADL map and its grading of campuses across the country, is we can see the picture that is not being reported for the most part, which is of repression, which is of fear, which is of our students and our faculty being demobilized and under an unprecedented campaign to silence their perspectives. And instead, what we see is overarching reporting around the claimed upsurge of anti-Semitism. One reason for this, of course, is the vested interest of those who would advance that narrative. But another reason is that we don't have good reporting of what's happening on our campuses, and for good reason, because people are afraid to report, because a report of an instance in which you face repression can easily be reframed as an instance in which you're guilty of anti-Semitism or in which you become the subject of investigation. And that, of course, is a very frightening environment. As a consequence, we have had a real difficulty countering the kind of picture statistically that's being put out with a more informed and balanced picture. And for this, I think we need to also dedicate some time and thinking to how we can reverse that trend.
Thank you so much, Aslı. Bassam.
Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the organizers for putting this together and all the people that have made this happen behind the scenes. My presentation title is The Unraveling of Israel and Academic Freedom, a Telling Tale. Any fogginess, analytical fogginess, or poor judgments made in my presentation are intentional in order to spur discussion later. I will read because I want to keep to time, and I'll read fast, but you won't notice it because you just heard Asli. Bismillah. My starting point is a simple fact. During the past months after the Hamas attacks of October 7th, Israel has destroyed or permanently damaged every single one of the 12 universities in Gaza, ending with detonating to the ground Al-Isra University on January 17th, the last one. The Euromed Human Rights Monitor, as well as many other independent organizations, details what is called educide, the destruction of educational institutions, which has also included the killing of professors, students, administrators, and the deprivation of tens of thousands of students from going to school in any capacity. This is my starting point on the discussion of the assault on academic freedom in the United States. The connections between the two are things I'm making as a starting point. And while there certainly have been some excesses in confronting this assault, the truth remains that this assault has also traversed into the supreme physical realm, not just the realm of disagreements and discomfort, when 3 Palestinian students were shot near the University of Vermont in November 2023, paralyzing one of them permanently. This assault has also resulted in the profound intimidation, suspension, and firing of university faculty across the country who are in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians. And besides the firing of 2 university presidents after grueling questioning in congressional hearings late last year, we now witness this week, actually, another supremely grueling questioning in another Inquisition-like hearing, except the new president of Colombia this time succumbs to almost all the unprecedented and unfathomable bullying by members of Congress who should be given a medal in gaslighting. It was horrific to watch, all 3 hours and 15 minutes of it. And I do not mince words when I say that if we sit here and watch this hearing together for the next 3 hours, it might just be as motivating to both understand the powers that seek to shut down academic freedom and also to mobilize against such efforts. I think everyone should watch the whole hearing to discern the shape of things to come, not just clips and quips. So in addition to being here to address knowledge production in the aftermath of October 7th, the title of this conference, we need to recognize in no uncertain terms the challenge we have ahead of us, a challenge that is not just discursive. It is political, institutional, legal, and most of all, strategic. We have to be up to it in ways that go beyond our comfort zones, in ways that address each of these realms. I hope one of the outcomes of these conversations here and elsewhere, because they are happening everywhere, is not simply what we usually do in conferences to register our comments, but to also register our initiatives, backed by the courage and the risks needed to follow through with defending our peers and engaging in joint action to put a stop to the witch hunts taking place in the name of duplicitous principles and actual racism, the unspoken kind, the most pernicious. And there's a lot of spoken kind too. A word on context. I must reiterate the larger context within which what we are witnessing is one of 76 years of Israel's dispossession and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, 57 years of military occupation of Palestinian territories, the proliferation of Jewish-only legal settlements that house approximately 700 Israelis in the West Bank, and the imposition of a dual system of apartheid rule, all documented and certified by international law and the entire independent human rights organizations landscape worldwide, including Israeli ones such as B'Tselem. I will not go over the calamitous human cost Israel has caused in Gaza as Dr. Atiya addressed it. We are not meeting to discuss, in my view, knowledge production in times of peace. Well, not just in my view. We are meeting in times of genocide, supported by this country, the United States, at the highest levels, all while being persecuted both on campus and in congressional hearings by the same people who, on the one hand, support racist-laden genocide with vigor, and on the other hand, they try to lecture us about racism, citing words and phrases, words they cannot pronounce, and phrases they don't understand, with reference points from ages gone by. But power does not need either. It just needs to be wielded, and that's what we need to contend with. Global isolation and domestic compensation. We're getting to my topic. Sorry, this was an introduction that was motivated largely by watching the hearing. This leaves me with less time to address the attack on academic freedom, but I do firmly believe the foregoing is just as important. The question is, how do we understand this wave against academic freedom and academics, and why is it connected to the ongoing genocide by Israel in Gaza, or at least the plausibility of genocide as the International Court of Justice determined, if you're allergic to the word genocide? Israel's growing international isolation and myth erosion in the emerging context is the emerging context within which the new campus or the new campaigns against academic freedom are taking place. However one conceives of the developments since October 7th in this regard, the formula is the same. The more Israel is degraded politically and in terms of global public opinion, notably in the United States, which it has been, the more intense the campaigns as well as the funding and political support that sustain them. And most importantly, the more large swaths of our political establishment lose their, it says here lose their shit, but with an asterisk, which I cannot like communicate because it's typed. So it's like shit with asterisk. Literally, there's no better way to address it. With every move of the needle towards a less flattering or more damaging development for Israel, the machine spurns more systematic efforts in the direction of repairing Israel's image or doing damage control by deliberately identifying the organizations and individuals in civil society for censure and sanction, notably in academia and at the most prestigious level, because the halls of power are covered in this regard. They don't have to work too hard on that at this point. Academics and academia produce knowledge and set agendas, and universities are the sites of the future, a future that the enemies of academic freedom know is not theirs if things go the way they're going now. While the onslaught against academics speaking out on Palestinian rights is increasing by the week since October, the one obvious and undeniable observation is the level of desperation of such campaigns, often making them a laughingstock for many and an object of skepticism for most. Still, they victimize the most vulnerable educators across US universities, namely adjunct professors and other non-tenured faculty, though none is beyond targeting, as we are going to see unfold in the coming couple of weeks in Colombia. I will not go through the history of organizations whose sole purpose is to serve as watchdogs on the question of Palestine and defame or blacklist academics, organizations like Campus Watch and later the Canary Mission and so on. I actually don't know anyone who has written anything or spoken out on Palestine who is not on them. It actually stopped being prestigious to be blacklisted by them. Today, these are now superseded by far more cynical campaigns and institutions, an often concerted effort, an entire edifice of organizations, donors, and individuals with a high profile are employing a variety of tactics to intimidate both academics, who usually have a stake in the struggle, and administrators, who usually do not have a stake in the struggle, usually, as well as university presidents. On the one hand, you have those who are in solidarity with the cause. On the other, you have administrators who must establish a balance between ethical matters and donor sensitivities, where their own future employment may also be at stake. You do the math to find out the propensity of either category to cave in and submit to the threat of reprisal, or just watch this week's hearing. The organizations involved can be traditional, overarching ones that, such as the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, or a new variety of grassroots organizations that have emerged in multiple locales to exercise a concerted defamation effort targeting supporters of Palestinian liberation. Mega donors like 12 minutes more. Mega donors like Bill Ackman, Mark Rowan, and others have implicitly and recently explicitly bankrolled both the usual suspect Ivy League universities and such off-campus organizations, often linking them organically. A recent article in Jadaliya, as well as several others elsewhere, detailed such new campaigns under the title AstroTurf Anti-Semitism Watchdogs by Amaya Gelman. The piece was described by our own Mariam Durrani, who's with us in this conference, as an excellent and much needed critical analysis of what academia is deeply embroiled in, particularly the systemic use of civil rights washing to conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism through lawfare, infrastructure, and practices. AstroTurfing refers to a campaign that operates through the large number of usually small local and national organizations that often have vague but well-funded origins, simulating grassroots movements. One such active group is Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism, MACA, which advocates that for quote unquote educational institutions to support Zionism and repress discussion of Palestine. A large number of faculty around the country, including Jewish faculty, have seen hit pieces written about them, accusing them of anti-Semitism, sometimes for as much as using the word Palestine, as we have seen in the cases of faculty in some Judaic, Jewish, and even Israeli studies programs, Oberlin, for instance. Other faculty, now numbering in the dozens, had a worse defamation experience simply for addressing language used by international law regarding military occupation, illegal settlements, and the like. MACA is not alone. Other such groups, including the Academic Engagement Network, AEN, which lobbies university administrators on academic freedom with a mission that, and I quote, engages, educates, and empowers U.S. university and college faculty and staff to oppose efforts to delegitimize Israel, unquote. This could simply mean describing Israel's policies such as the continuous building of settlements, illegal settlements, or simply calling attention to its dual system of laws and policies constituting apartheid. The array of such organizations engaging in lawfare are often connected to students, groups on campus, or individual students who are capable of or connected, not least within this increasingly malleable and compromised university system and context. Such connections have led in some occasions to get a faculty member fired if they reach the right powers that be within the university, armed with information that motivates administrators to avoid headache or to preserve donations and donors, hence the connection part. The tactics of intimidation used have now become household terms: doxing, lawfare, social media smearing and defamation, civil rights complaints, complaints to university administrators, various forms of advertising, all the way down to the individual communication by superiors, senior faculty, and or administrators themselves. The lead complaint is an accusation of anti-Semitism, now wielded so lightly, so politically, so ignorantly, and so hypocritically at times that those who have fought anti-Semitism their whole life, including Jews who are often at the forefront of the movement against Israel's genocide, are considered anti-Semitic. On the other hand, and I'll be closing, I'll pull what you pulled. You're like, I have 10 more seconds. Then you go for 2 minutes. I love it. I'm already, yeah, I know. I delayed my comment
Enhanced the process.
because of the hearing. It's not my fault. On the other hand, those who have actually peddled in anti-Semitic tropes and language their entire lives are exempt and get a get out of jail card simply because they are pro-Israel, including our 46th president, former President Donald Trump, and billionaire Elon Musk, plus dozens more in the public eye, let alone a wide variety of right or extreme right-wing politicians, pundits, and media personalities. I'll just close by sharing that I'll skip all kinds of things. I'll share that I'd like to affirm by way of conclusion that the sanctioning witch hunts, watchdog groups, and well-heeled campaigns against academic freedom in the United States is not at the root of the problem. Rather, it is Israel's slide into infamy based on the continuation of its military occupation, the expansion of racist and illegal settlements in the West Bank, and now the slaughter and starvation of a whole population in Gaza. In a way, supporters of Israel are impotent because the problem of Israel's apartheid is not a discursive one. It's a material one that is outside their control, while at the same time causing them to trample on the very principles they pretend to defend in order to save Israel and its image. But it's a downward spiral, to be sure. The more they work, the more intractable their problem is in the medium to long run, but not without our effort to stand up courageously and speak out despite risk, but not without our effort to stand up courageously and speak despite risk. Most importantly, Israel's problem will not be resolved even if every single Israel supporter in the United States was made to feel completely comfortable in the complete absence of critiques of Israel. Racism and exclusion have never been resolved by silencing its opponents. Okay, sorry.
Thank you, Bassam. Negar.
Should I stand up there?
You either stay there or up there.
Oh. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay? Is this all right? Thank you for coming so early and for all of you online. And thank you to the organizers at IMS for organizing this obviously very, very important discussion. So my presentation is called Teaching in and Against the Marketplace of Ideas After 10/7. October 7th. Aslı and Bassam provided the important moral, political, legal, and geopolitical context which requires us to speak up in this moment, but also that puts so much pressure and constraint on our ability to do so. I'm going to shift gears slightly and talk about the political economy of knowledge production as it affects specifically, and I took the part about teaching very seriously for this panel, in terms of how we as educators, both inside and outside the classroom, owe it to our students to give them tools to how to navigate this political economy. Switch slide. Whoa. Got it. There we go. Oh, so that's even easier. Thank you. All right, so I have three-ish questions that are going to guide my discussion today. First one, what is the marketplace of ideas and how is the university embedded within this marketplace? Secondly, how has the marketplace shifted since October 7th? And finally, how can we teach in and against it since then? All right. Part one, what is the marketplace of ideas? So I was introduced to this concept through my fieldwork. Just as quick background, you have my bio, but I'm trained as a political anthropologist, and I study knowledge production on the SWANA region, or Middle East region as it's known, from within the US security apparatus. I critically examine the role of policy experts at DC think tanks, and I'm literally looking at some of their pictures and quotes in this room. And how they shape US security imaginaries and policies toward this diverse region. It was through my interlocutors that I was first introduced to the concept of the marketplace of ideas, which they very openly embrace. It's a concept that has a very positive connotation within Washington, just to point that out. Political scientist who's at Fletcher, Daniel Dresner, defines the marketplace in very vague terms as the array of intellectual outputs and opinions about foreign affairs and the extent to which policymakers and publics embrace those ideas. Okay. The marketplace of ideas could pretty much apply to domestic or foreign, but how it is used within the seats of power is very much as it relates to foreign affairs and national security issues. So that's key in terms of the presentation. So it's clearly moving away from a Habermasian ideal of a democratic public sphere and instead very openly taking on the logics of late state capitalism, where these elites imagine themselves as these sort of thought entrepreneurs in an unregulated space where all ideas about foreign policy and national security can compete equally in order for the best ideas to emerge. Right? This is in the imaginary. But as I show through my own work, this marketplace has grown into a multi-billion-dollar site of transnational exchange, and I do mean billion. It includes different governments, think tanks, media conglomerates, lobbying firms, civil society organizations, weapons manufacturers, and other corporations that try to influence the US government and broader publics on issues of national security and foreign policy. Not surprisingly, doesn't fully show there. The marketplace has, not surprisingly, the marketplace has largely acted as a hegemonic site of exchange, limiting and circulating only those ideas that ensure the status quo of US military and economic supremacy globally and in this region in particular. Throughout my research, I draw attention to the intricate networks of funding, as well as the affective and epistemic techniques used by these elite experts to shape both government and public opinions on issues ranging from military intervention to sanctions policy. So now this is the part that's relevant, is that universities have long been a part of this marketplace, not after October 7th, they have long been a part of this marketplace. Scholars and administrators aligned with the hegemonic neoliberal logics of this market have openly embraced and indeed taken advantage of the site of exchange for their own material and political gains. Though nearly all of them would deny that this money affects their scholarship or that it affects their teaching, right? When I used to give these presentations before October 7th, I would always have someone pull me aside and say, but there's something different about universities than think tanks. Our donors don't put pressures on us. They don't affect our teaching and they don't affect our scholarship. There's separation, right? As we know, October 7th has sort of debunked that myth, I think, for all of us. And then I can't go without saying that though the marketplace itself is not the cause of this, it very much affects the fact that 68% of faculty in the United States are on contracts. They are not tenured, and those that are on the tenure track are not even counted in this, so they don't have the protections of tenure. And as Bassam noted, even those that have tenure are now under threat. This makes a big difference in terms of who can speak up and the effects of speaking up in this market. And as someone who's contingent faculty, I feel important that I bring this up and to talk about how difficult it is sometimes to call out the thing, right, when your job is on the line. So now moving on, because time is limited, and I was seriously banking on Bassam going over. So how has the marketplace shifted since October 7th? So there's good and bad and ugly. The good is that we're seeing a breaking up of the monopoly on voices and discourses in this marketplace. All right. Yes, the traditionally powerful actors in these spaces are essentially acting as in completely predictable ways, right? All the think tanks here in DC are doing what we expected. The mainstream media is continuing its decades-long anti-Palestinian bias, and government officials are reinforcing pro-Israeli narratives. But their discourses and ideas are not going unchallenged. And social media here has become an important tool. TikTok very quickly emerged as a place where younger users could express support and solidarity with Palestine in ways that circumvented and then directly challenged these dominant pro-Israeli discourses. I read a statistic this morning from the Pew Research Fund that 170 million Americans use TikTok, 6 in 10 teenagers, and more than 40% users say they use it as their regular source of news. That's huge, okay? Other platforms, namely Instagram, has become one of the most important means by which Palestinians themselves have been able to document, resist, and mobilize global action against the Israeli genocidal attack in Gaza and systemic violence, dispossession, and mass oppression in the West Bank, and indeed within the 48 boundaries. We all heard almost immediately about another, thanks to social media, right? Twitter and Instagram have also allowed critical voices to call out the longstanding anti-Palestinian biases of mainstream media. While we can't draw easy correlations between social media and public opinion, we're seeing important shifts in the past 7 months in terms of their impact on US public opinion, generally, but most especially on young Americans. Again, our students, right? Of course, those in power have taken notice too. As we speak, the House of Representatives is going to attempt to once again ban TikTok. All right, and they say it's ostensibly because of its ties to China, but they have made it quite clear before that it very much is their fear of how much pro-Palestinian content is being produced on TikTok. And then let's not overly romanticize these corporations, because of course they've also been sites of surveillance, censorship, disinformation, and also they have quite literally kicked people off the platforms, right? Meanwhile, at universities, so sort of seeing how the marketplace is acting after October 7th, these rifts in the marketplace are playing out in the realm of funding. Right? So now we are openly talking about the role of donors in intervening on campuses in a way that did not exist really before, right? People are drawing attention to the fact that donors play an outsized role in censorship. Am I still doing okay? Interestingly, It's happening in all directions. You are going to see more and more quote unquote scare pieces about Arab funding and its role in radicalizing the student population. You're going to see more and more stories like this coming out soon. Just keep your eye on it. All right. So this idea of drawing attention to the marketplace of ideas plays out in various directions. All right. So this is how I'm going to wrap up. All right. So how does this affect us in terms of the classroom? Right. And I posed this question in the paper that I circulated beforehand, which is, will these potential tensions and growing competition within the marketplace of ideas, and even just the recognition of the marketplace of ideas and its impact on the university, will that have an impact on those of us who teach, who not only oppose US empire, but the marketplace itself, right? And I don't have time to go into all the ways that we can do this, but I'm just gonna put these out, and I'd love for us to, collectively to think of ways that we can draw this out within the classroom. But one of them is to teach our students how to track the marketplace at the university. And already you're beginning to see students doing that by looking at, where's the university investing? These are questions that students are asking. And even at Columbia, that was one of the concessions that the students won, is that there is now going to be complete financial transparency regarding the investments. Let's see how that plays out in real life. But there's an awareness now that we need to look at this political economy of knowledge production, right? Not just in terms of donors, but also where are these huge endowments, what are they being invested in, right? The other is to, again, draw attention to how this affects those on campus who are quote unquote contingent faculty or on contracts. I have done this experiment on teaching evaluations, where I won't say anything on teaching evaluation with one class. And in the second one, I draw attention to the fact that teaching evaluations are biased against women, against people of color, against people who are critical of power. And I always get more constructive feedback when I give that caveat at the beginning. And I tell them, be critical of me. Tell me what's wrong with the class. But overall, I'm going to tell you that teaching evaluations are biased. And I always get better evaluations. First of all, more of them fill it out. They take it seriously. They write really good, helpful comments. And it's not just, oh, I was bored or whatever. Like, they really, really take it seriously. And that's one thing that professors can do, is like draw attention to the fact how these tools are used to harm faculty who are on contingent or on the tenure track. And my time's up. Okay, I'll do the 10-second trick. And then the very last one is learn how the marketplace operates outside the university. And this is something that I always do with my students because of my area of expertise, but I will literally walk them through how to read experts. I'll take an article from that day, and I could literally pick any article. And that's the sad thing. Okay, so this one happened on April 17th on Iran's attack on Israel. I find every expert that's named in it, and then I walk them through how to find that expert. Where did they study? Where are the organizations they were affiliated with? Okay, and then who funds those organizations? And very quickly, you get things like US Department of Defense, US Department of State, Smith Richardson Foundation. You get all this data that tells you these are not objective experts. These are people with clear conflicts of interest, and yet they're being presented as objective experts in these articles. And it's a really helpful, I think, tangible tool. And then I'm not going to go through that. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to discuss more.
Thank you so much, Negar. Judith.
Okay. Well, I'm just want to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me and giving me this wonderful position of being discussant for 3 fantastic papers from 3 very, very esteemed colleagues. So and of course, these papers in this panel could not be more timely, as has been pointed out. And like Bassam, in preparation for today's panel, I treated myself to watching the anti-Semitism hearings held Wednesday by the House Committee on Education and Workforce. The whole thing, 3 hours and 15 minutes. And I listened to the Congress people grill Columbia President Minouche Shafik and her henchman, or maybe she was their henchwoman, along with her, there was the faculty co-chair of Columbia's new anti-Semitism task force, as well as two Columbia trustees. And they were being, of course, grilled about anti-Semitism at Columbia. So over 3 hours, and I also, along with Bassam, recommend you watch it if you haven't done so already in its entirety. Over 3 hours, dominated by performative harangues, rhetorical questions, really vicious attacks on several Columbia faculty members. Sorry. And the total elision of anti-Semitism with any critique of Israel. It was relieved only briefly, by the way, by Jamal Bowman and Ilhan Omar, who asked some questions that actually tried to solicit real information from Shafiq. But otherwise, it was a repeated spectacle of dragging yet another university professor before a congressional committee hearing, dictating what can and cannot be said on American campuses, calling upon administrators to fire faculty and expel students for free speech related offenses, and threatening more scrutiny and intervention to come. So the real highlight of this performance, at least for me, came towards the end when Congressman Roger Williams, Republican from Texas, expressed his personal concern about how these academic administrators were presiding over developments on campus that, in his view, mirrored developments in German universities during the Nazi era, and which he had learned about from reading the US Holocaust Museum website. And according to Williams, these Nazis had denounced professors, demanded statements of conforming loyalty from faculty and administrators, permitted and encouraged the intervention of groups from outside the campus, and oversaw the triumph of politics in the university. So I might be forgiven for being confused about who he thought was being what, doing what to whom, right? So I was also struck by how much various framings in this hearing resonated with points that our panelists are making today. Terror and terrorism loomed large in committee discourse. Jewish students were being terrorized on campus. Speakers from terrorist groups who support terrorism had been hosted by student groups and by faculty. Specific faculty were accused of promoting terror. So the war on terror now must be fought, apparently, on American campuses. Talk of academic freedom, talk of free speech, that was very muted. It was raised a few times, rather half-heartedly, by the Columbia crew, but otherwise under suspicion as providing cover for faculty discrimination against Jewish students. There was certainly no rigorous or even coherent line of questioning or answering about how to weigh prohibitions of discrimination and defamation against the imperatives of free speech and academic freedom on campus. And certain words were not spoken at all, with singular exceptions and momentary exceptions, again by Bowman and Omar. But certain words were just absent, the words Palestine, Palestinian, Gaza, war. If a Rip Van Winkle awoke in this hearing room from a 6.5-month sleep, he would have no clue that there was genocide and ethnic cleansing in progress. So before I move from my somewhat less than positive review of this hearing, I would like to observe that the Columbia performance was not reassuring about the future of academic freedom. Shafiq and her team repeatedly ceded ground to their inquisitors, not only failing to contest egregious characterizations of what constituted sanctionable anti-Semitism, like from the river to the sea, but even agreeing that such speech was indeed anti-Semitic and impermissible. There was no defense of the academic freedom of the faculty being attacked by the members of the committee. And President Shafiq told of plans to expand Middle East studies at Columbia and hire new faculty that would, in her words, broaden the approach of the department, seemingly in accord with the notion that current faculty were not doing their job properly. And now, of course, we know that she returned to her campus to call police to come into Columbia and arrest and over 100 student protesters who also, I believe, have been suspended from Columbia University. So as a historian and as someone who has spent now pretty much a lifetime in Middle East studies, I have been trying to think about how we arrived at this alarming juncture and if it constitutes some kind of continuity or break with the past. Now, we know that American universities, particularly elite institutions, have never been ivory towers. I think Negar has made that very clear for us. And they've never been insulated from the political agendas of the day. And labor history teaches us as much. 1905, for example, egged on by university administration, Columbia students turned out in droves to act as scabs and break the New York subway workers' strike. As the showdown between labor and capital continued, strike breaking became kind of an honored extracurricular activity in elite universities. In 1919, Harvard students helped to break the strike of the Boston police by serving as substitute officers, and the Harvard president called upon students to participate in this public service, and the university actually even set up a recruitment office. Another important era, of course, and one with which I think we're all somewhat familiar, was the war in Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s. And universities were very much part of the American war as centers for war-related research, for example, and also as suppliers of key military personnel through their ROTC, their Reserve Officers Training Programs. Many faculty and students, however, even at the elite universities, were no longer with the program. And you are familiar, I'm sure, with the anti-war movement that took place across the country, and especially on campuses where war research and ROTC programs were special targets. Administrations reacted in ways that resonate today, suspending and expelling students, exiling faculty from classrooms and denying them tenure, calling in police to arrest and charge members of the university community. Now, there was a government commission that made a study of this campus unrest, as it was called. But to the best of my knowledge, and I've kind of looked around, I stand to be corrected, but I don't think there were any congressional hearings of the type that we are seeing today that called administrators on the carpet to explain what was going on at their universities. The precedent for such hearings can only be found in, as far as I can see, in the 1950s McCarthy era, when the targets of investigation were closet communists and other disloyal types who lurked in the State Department, the military, the entertainment business, and only tangentially, actually, the academy. So this contemporary attack on academic freedom does seem to differ from what we see in the past. My personal experience also reinforces this sense of novelty. I mean, I came to Middle East studies through the Palestine door, actually, and support for Palestinian rights to self-determination and Palestinian resistance was my first point of engagement with the Middle East region. I was an early and active member of Marab Reports, the publication that was trying to educate the American left about the Middle East and about Palestine in particular. So I was a fairly vocal and visible pro-Palestinian graduate student in the 1970s, and I was not worried about what that meant for my future in the academy. When it came time to choosing a thesis topic, my advisor did not warn me off Palestine. Actually, he was much more concerned about my academic future and how it would be hampered by my pursuit of women's history. So I don't want to romanticize the Middle East studies world of the 1970s. I also was a gleeful co-author in 1975 of Marab's expose of what we called the Middle East Studies Network, a piece in which we surveyed all the ways in which the field had been implicated in government and corporate power structures from its post-World War II beginnings, and how it was still deeply entrenched in its role of service to American imperial projects. I think the major difference, however, was that we did not expect to be personally attacked or persecuted for our views. Probably in large part, this was a measure of our marginality. We were not numerous or well-placed enough to threaten the hegemonic discourse. Much has changed in the world of Middle East studies since then, and perhaps we need to think about this moment of outright attack on academic freedom, at least in part as a badge of success, a reflection of how much progress has been made in challenging dominant discourses, at least in academic spaces. So our panelists today have shed much light on the challenges to academic freedom we are facing and how we might think about how to hold our ground. I very much appreciated how Aslı Bâli set the patterns of censorship in Middle East studies, past and present, in the context of academic freedom and free speech. It's always good to have a lawyer around. And I trust we all agree that the realization and preservation of the university as a space of free inquiry, critical thinking, unfettered exploration of competing ideas, I mean, this is central to the production of knowledge and the equipping of students to be members of democratic societies. And Aslı clarified for us the potential harms to this space that are being threatened currently by anti-Semitism campaigns. The prohibition of discrimination sets valid limits on campus speech, and anti-Semitism, like anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim stances, must be called out. The problem we face at the moment, however, as Aslı pointed out, is that critical scholarship on Israel-Palestine can be reframed as anti-Semitism and labeled discriminatory, a dangerous move that plays into the hands of a right-wing movement working to suppress critical inquiry across the board into race and gender, for example. Aslı also identifies the challenges universities confront as they struggle with pressures from donors, alumni, media, political interventions, all of which encroach on the ability of administrations to protect controversial speech. So I'd like to raise a couple of questions for Aslı. The first concerns legal discrimination and the line between discomfort and threat. Could you help us understand when speech crosses the line from being unpopular or offensive, say, to constituting plausible legal discrimination? And a second question is about extramural speech, something that's come up with several of our panelists. Most of the attacks on faculty and students, as we know, have been based on their social media. What is the difference, or what should be the difference, between expression of views inside and outside campus walls? I think in your talk, you related it to, you called upon us to remember that we are rights holders. I'd like to sort of understand how those rights differ depending upon how we are situated, whether we are performing our professional duties or whether we are in our private life, and how exactly does that play out? And a third question, which is actually going to be a question for everybody, has to do with issues that I think Negar brought up about how universities are so entwined with power structures that, one begins to ask the question, can administrations are administrations compelled in ways that are very difficult to avoid, to acquiesce in limiting academic freedom when the hegemon so requires, because of how implicated universities are and how permeated they are by these power structures. Okay, moving to Bassam Haddad's paper. Yep. Bassam focused on the shared rhythms of assaults on academic freedom and the decline in support for Israel as anti-war sentiment grew and pro-Israel positions became more and more untenable. Long-standing patterns of censorship of Middle East studies acquired a new vitality. And of course, Bassam reminds us a lot of this is not new. We do have a history of persecution of colleagues in our field who are vocal or perhaps just too visible with their critical scholarship on Israel-Palestine. And I would say, based on my own personal experience, I think this has been particularly the case in the past 2 decades. I would date it back, the beginnings back of kind of all-out attacks, you know, the rise of pro-Israel blacklisting groups like Campus Watch Canary Mission. It really begins in the early 2000s, actually, so a couple of decades. So what we are seeing today is not unprecedented, but it's more organized, it's more vicious, it's apparently more moneyed. And as Bassam points out, there are some new tactics being used, like doxing and civil rights washing, the latter of which I'd like to know a little bit more about. So I hope you are correct, Bassam, about the inherent limitations to these silencing campaigns as the awareness of the full extent of the destruction and massacres becomes more and more apparent. A couple of more specific questions. First of all, you do mention precarious faculty, several of our panelists do, the adjuncts, the untenured, and how they have been more vulnerable, how they are more vulnerable in this situation. And so could I ask you to reflect on how structural changes in the university has made our task more difficult? The corporatization that we have all lived through that has led to the growth of more and more precarity as more adjuncts are hired and tenure lines are eliminated. And our students have been redefined as customers who must be pleased and placated at all costs. And then a second question concerns the apparent lack of backbone in administrators who seem to knuckle under. How has corporatization increased the power of donors and rendered presidents basically fundraisers rather than visionaries and inspirers of their faculty and students? And as we know, or at least as we read, many presidents of universities are headed out the door as the job grows ever more thankless, as they must answer to board members and donors, and now apparently congressional inquisitors. And finally, I turn to Negar Razavi's paper on the marketplace of ideas, this rather unfree marketplace in which what is thinkable about the Middle East and therefore shapes opinion and policy is itself shaped and circulated. So it was appreciated learning about all the government agencies, think tanks, media conglomerates, lobbying firms, advocacy groups, weapons manufacturers, other corporations, and the high level of agreement about the desirability of US hegemony in the Middle East. And of course, Negar suggests that universities are strongly implicated, permeated by this network of interests, as the famous revolving door between universities, government, corporate careers certainly illustrates, at least at my university. And Negar also invites us to think about the role of social media that, at least in part, breaks out of this closed circuit and provides some competition. And suggests, I think, that universities crack down on extramural expression precisely because it eludes the traditional boundaries of the marketplace. And I think it was very helpful to provide suggestions, and the paper does even more so, about how students can be encouraged to explore the production and consumption of knowledge about the Middle East, how they can really become critical thinkers in the process. So closing with some questions for Negar. The first one is, you talk about the kind of struggles over state regulation of social media that are unfolding. And I would like to hear more of your thoughts about how these regulations might or might not be likely to suppress the potential for forms of social media that privilege the non-hegemonic voice going forward. How much trouble are we in here? And then a second question concerns while individual faculty and scholarly associations are pushing back against university repression of criticism of Israel, how much conformity, or at least quiescence, has been bought over time by making public criticism of Israel or public support for Palestine, or even the choice to focus research on Palestine, very costly in terms of an academic career. In other words, how possible or impossible has it been for scholars themselves to step outside the boundaries of this marketplace? And how do we measure and combat these kinds of hidden restraints on speech and scholarship? A question that I think applies to all our panelists across the board. Thanks so much, and thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Judith. I think we'll start by giving each of the panelists, Bassam, Haddad, 2 minutes to respond to Judith, excellent remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, Aslı, do you want to go first?
Okay, 2 minutes, it's impossible, but just a couple of thoughts. I didn't make it to the comments on anti-terrorism, war on terror here. I put them in the paper, and Judith mentioned them in her discussive remarks, but it's worth noting that there's been a great white paper that Daryl Lee put out with the Center for Constitutional Rights and Palestine Legal, tracing the origins of anti-terrorism statutes in the United States from the beginning in the 1960s, tying them directly to Palestine and the criminalization of Palestinians, Palestinian resistance, and the association of Palestinians with terrorism. So when we hear the kinds of things that Judith just repeated from the congressional hearing, this is the mobilization of really longstanding tropes, and it brings an entire different legal frame. So there's the frame of material support and terrorist speech, and the frame of discrimination. And in both of these contexts, essentially existing categories that are designed to restrain the spectrum of speech are being manipulated in a way that needs to be resisted. And so there are lots of different ways to resist. Judith asked a specific question around discomfort and how it gets mobilized. So let's just remember first that higher education's goal is to produce forms of discomfort. It is unsettling received wisdoms that students come to universities with and confronting them with controversial ideas, alternative paradigms, et cetera, in order to instill habits of critical thinking that enable them to examine and re-examine those received wisdoms and then make decisions for themselves how they're going to engage with them, whether they decide to retain that stance that they came in with. This is especially important for diasporic populations. And in many ways, Jewish communities in the United States and on university campuses are behaving in exactly the way that you would expect diasporic communities to do, which is exhibiting tendencies to be more royalist than the king, exhibiting ultra loyalty to a national imagined identity and participation in an imagined community through really doubling down on received wisdoms. Of course, they're going to experience intense discomfort in this moment. That's the very purpose of the university, connecting one more time, what is our enterprise? What is the vocation? And then stepping back and asking some questions that Negar has put on the table. In this political economy, is it possible to vindicate those goals and that exercise? Our administrators are primarily fundraisers to begin with. They're facing donors, their own jobs are precarious to some extent and depend upon their ability to raise money. So they're in a disciplinary environment that is not defined for the purpose of advancing the mission of the university, but rather dependency on private philanthropy in order to sustain the ability to just keep the university functioning as an employer and as a profit-making nonprofit. In the context of private universities and in the context of public universities as a competitor to those private universities. That political economy of knowledge production is intrinsically in tension with the actual purpose of a university. And we once had much more broadly publicly funded universities in much of the rest of the world. That remains the definition of the higher education sector. Wherever we see the encroachment of the actual market in the ways that Negar has described, we also see with it a restraining of the permissible spectrum of speech and academic inquiry. Let me turn to the social media question as my last point. What does social media mean? Do we police the ability of faculty to write op-eds as an example? Jody Dean's instance is a really good example. She wrote a piece on a blog. Is this her social media engagement? It was Verso's blog. It was a blog designed to promote her book, a book that engages critically with ideas about legitimate violence and the uses and framings of resistance. The blurring of lines between what counts as intramural and extramural speech is a function of the nature of knowledge production and dissemination in this era. To mark off social media as somehow a different domain is simply, once again, a form of mystification. All of the rights that we have as academics apply to our speech wherever we're disseminating our expertise. That's our literal job, and anybody who fails to protect it is in tension with any meaningful understanding of what the educational, pedagogical, scholarly enterprise is.
Sam?
Thank you, Shay. I should have failed you when you took my class at Georgetown. Singling me out. Do you get canceled for saying things like this? Do I make my existing students feel uncomfortable by saying things? Okay. Okay, so I'll try to meet Shai's 2-minute warning. So am I right about the connection between Israel's position and the viciousness of the campaign? I actually shared in the paper to you, but not, I couldn't read some segments. Yes, there is a temporality and contingency here. Nothing's automatic. So the temporality is that Israel's compromised standing is causing frantic and abusive responses that are adding fuel to the fire that is pushing in the direction of compromising Israel's position even further vis-a-vis large swaths of the population. So yes, these campaigns may succeed in the short run, but are self-defeating in the long run. So that's the temporality. However, without effort, and the contingency is that without effort by everyone who is critical of these campaigns, who is beholden to the principles that supposedly universities uphold, uh, the, the formula I'm describing will not work very well. But I am convinced that even without the maximum effort, which would require maximum strategy, not just principles, right? Strategies that are ethical, because there's nothing that we are fighting for that is not. But it does still require strategies. But even without the optimal maximization of strategies, there is something from which Israel cannot come back from in terms of its narratives and myths. So that is something that I think we can watch and see. The other questions, how universities are intertwined with power structures, how structural corporatization of the university has affected the most vulnerable, and how corporatization increased power to donors and rendered presidents beholden to them rather than to the educational and intellectual dimension of the institution itself, and so on. I'm going to combine them in one question and address that so I can meet my time limit. Essentially, in my view, in terms of universities being intertwined with power structures and the effect, basically the effect is neoliberalism on the one hand and Orientalism, or the revival of Orientalism on the other hand, defined a little differently, but this is the quick term that we can use. More than that, what we are witnessing is very simple, and people have been writing about it long before October 7th, which is the neoliberalism of the university system. It's neoliberalism actually par excellence, the commodification of education, whereby value is calculated in transactional, not developmental or intellectual terms, nor in terms of the well-being of students and society. So, and this is not new to any of us, but this is the effect. And within this sort of effect, power and neoliberalism work really well together. But we have learned from history that when they work really well together and thrive on each other's potential ephemeral successes, there is a dip afterwards. And that dip is what I'm addressing. And that is where I'm saying we could come in as a community of educators and, you know, activists, as well as people just interested in the future of the academic enterprise and academic institutions themselves, to hasten that that movement.
Thanks so much, Bassam. Negar?
None of us stick to the 2 minutes, huh? Thankless job, I feel like. All right, so I will, thank you so much for the thoughtful comments, Judith. I guess I'll combine all of them into one so that I can answer coherently. Basically, the question I took from you is there a way out of this when we are so implicated in this marketplace? And I think there's always a way out. And I think we need to draw on social movement theory to sort of guide us in terms of different ways and different tactics at various levels, depending on understand your own positionality and power within these structures, and then work to those strengths. And I think one of the things that faculty are terrible at is working with one another, thinking of themselves in terms of a social and working together. And this is a product of the consumerization, is people are out for themselves. They're worried about their own precarious positions. But there are things that we can learn from social movements to go against very powerful forces. And I use social media as sort of a way for us to start thinking about these openings. Again, I'm not romanticizing social media. That's not going to save us from all of this. This isn't our path to liberation or decolonization at all. These are very hegemonic tools, but they allow us to break through a little bit. And it means that our students are coming already critical of power. They may not be grounded in knowledge of the region, but they're already skeptical of mainstream media. And that's something you can work with, right? And then you can also work collectively with your colleagues. And I think that's where there's a lot that we can still do. And then the last thing I want to say is that before I did this presentation, I spoke to friends that are in very conservative states. And a lot of the attention has been on the Columbias and the Harvards, but people who are in states like Arkansas, where BDS is illegal, or Oklahoma, and they're literally the only faculty on campus that works on the Middle East, they are facing a completely different landscape. And they urged me to sort of bring up the point that sometimes you have to do things quietly. You have to do things quietly within your classroom, and that's the space where you have power. And I don't think we should poo-poo on that either. You know, people are in these really like difficult positions, and I think the classroom can be a space to start to develop critical ideas by naming the thing itself. And then there's so much power in that. I'm in a city where people thrive on not naming the thing. Because if you name the thing, then people become critical of it. So name the thing for your students, give them tools to bring it down, right?
Thank you so much, Negar. We're about to open this up for questions. We have a little bit over 10 minutes, maybe we'll go a tiny bit over. But before we do, we're trying something a little bit new this time. So we're going to do a 3-minute break where we're asking people here in the audience to do this process of a peer review of their question, where they turn to the person next to them and basically engage them and tell them what they're thinking of asking. And what we want to do here is to ensure that the question is actually a question and not a statement or a personal anecdote, and to ensure that they're not asking the speakers here to do something that is beyond their capacity or outside their purview of their topic or expertise. So in 3 minutes, we'll reconvene. We'll take questions from the audience and from the online audience, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, nice to see you, Shay.
I saw Hazkani came, and I was in conversation with him at Yale last week, and
Oh,
he
yeah,
had
we
just
were
had a
just-
meal with you.
Yes, we had a
Yeah.
meal. We even went to see Rod, the upco.
Patriots.
Yeah, just Patriots without being Patriots. It was great to see him.
Well, yeah.
So I'm there Tuesday.
I have sung your praises nonstop. I'm sure, I don't know if it's the case that it's proliferated invitations, but I still view your plenary panel.
I did the mix and then I was still
It's still exhausting.
in shock, and so only now.
What about you? Has it been 3 hours? Yeah.
But it's also.
Which is exactly. Yeah.
I hear that now.
Yeah.
Oh, has she?
Yeah.
Oh,
By
okay.
the district.
Adala said, yeah, the state's appeal was rejected.
I mean, it's so stupid of them to do something.
It's, no, I mean,
With
Ben
her-
Gvir, like, come on, like the guy, that's just a hilarious
Really?
series of own goals, everything. Everywhere. I mean, also his, tweets this morning. Our government run amok.
Surprised was I was still surprised. You know,
But yeah, definitely.
And let go.
Right.
Oh, it's like, kind of,
Everything.
yeah, I mean,
Right.
like, yeah, I watched that hearing on Wednesday, it's like,
Yeah.
where am I?
I
You
was
know?
actually on Columbia's campus, and I'm giving a talk, and it's like,
No, I don't-
I was actually. The organizers required me to write.
The idea that,
You know, I gave it.
you said like, wait, time.
All right. This was only a 3-minute break, so we are going to now convene. I know the panelists are waiting and hoping for some tough questions. Hopefully not too much trolling, but let's and Christian, you're gonna help me with the online questions. Let's start with the people that we have here. Questions for our wonderful panelists. We'll take a few of them and then we'll ask them to respond briefly in this 2-minute sort of time spans. So let's start with questions here. Yeah, absolutely.
If the framing is not best, oh, it's Islamophobia or anti-Palestinianism, certainly religion is problematic. I hope it's not just, well, it's just free speech. What is the framing that doesn't lose the audience, that compels the audience to think? If it's not just, well, there's anti-Semitism, there's anti-Palestinian. What's the framing that gets people to think further rather than just in a sort of binary that isn't tenable?
Mal?
I was interested in the question of how do we manage a public discourse around a rise in anti-Semitism and other forms, you know, and Islamophobia, but especially anti-Semitism, and the quantitative, you know, a need to quantify or elucidate the data on that when the large institutions that are doing this work are all weaponizing anti-Semitism. So do we have alternate institutions? Do we say, you know, do we create those institutions? Do we go ethnographic and sort of not do data, not do quantitative data and do other kinds of data? What's our recourse given this problem?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, so a lot of what we'll talk about is the rise in the sort of willingness of university administrators and others to go full on policing of content, right? You can't say this, you can't say that. And the need to combat that, which is certainly the case. But in addition to those completely brazen constraints on academic freedom, I think we also see a rise in so-called like time, place, manner, like the procedural cover for content regulation. Like that, when you look at it, you can see very clearly what the aim is, which is to stop certain kinds of speech, but it's not, but it may not be done through the language of content control. And there are, of course, legal protections for, or they have, this is permissible. You can't control certain things. So how do we fight those efforts and kind of get around the procedural cover for content?
And Christian, there's some online. You wanna? So let me turn to the panelists. Negar, you want to start?
Sure. I'm not an expert on pedagogy or anything. It was more of an invitation for us to think about that collectively in terms of ways that colleagues who are in very, very difficult campus climates, they want to do something. And unfortunately, there's a lot of pressure. And so what I was suggesting is that we teach our students how to consume or read or engage knowledge critically by looking at who is producing that knowledge, who's funding that knowledge, how is that knowledge being circulated, and why are you receiving it in the form that you're receiving it, right? And so that doesn't get you to, you don't even have to bring up the word Israel or Palestine in order to do that kind of work. And that may be helpful for those faculty that are in these extremely precarious positions, is giving your students the tools to read critically and to understand things like conflict of interest. What happens when there's no peer review? What is ethics in law and research? And who are we reading? And why are you consuming the information that you're consuming, essentially?
Sure. So I think the framing issue question about, how to, how to go, where to go from here. I actually don't, I think it's really important on the one hand, but it's not a huge puzzle. I mean, in what I do in my classroom, and what I'm assuming everyone does, is to try to move the conversation from one about, just feelings, or uh, just the liberal A has an issue and B has an issue, what do we do, to the things available to all of us that we supposedly believe in for the most part, including international law and the human rights landscape. If I mean, in the case of Palestine, Israel, it's actually quite clear, especially in the past few years, since 2021, for instance, when the word apartheid is no longer confined to left-wing folks, going crazy and saying nutty stuff. So there's the international law community, the international law and regulations dimension, and then there's the human rights dimension. So that's definitely one thing that I keep coming back to. And it's frankly, I don't like to say this word because I don't actually practice that approach, but a lot of people would want to, I'm assuming. That's safe. That's safe and it's effective. It's quite effective. It actually takes you away from being defensive and puts you in a position where you're not being offensive or on the offense, but it basically creates starting points that supposedly we all agree on. The second point that I use repeatedly is the question of power relations. We don't have A and B. We have a subjugation by a powerful force, orders of magnitude more powerful of another uh, entity. And that power relation defines not just this conflict, but all other things that we teach. For instance, when I teach on authoritarian rule in the Arab world, and we speak of Arab dictatorships and the opposition, which is not often our cup of tea, but you can't look at the opposition as the problem. It's actually those with power who are the problem and who can change things. Otherwise, whether it's an opposition to authoritarian rule or an occupied peoples by a military occupation that is vicious, long-standing, and well-heeled and well-supported, the only thing that the weaker party can do is be subjugated in peace. That's the only thing they can do, whereas the powerful parties are able to change the nature of the relationship if the circumstances apply, if donor patron countries step in, and so on and so forth. So when we take power out of the equation, we descend into a vanilla liberal conversation about A and B have complaints and have uh, resentment and so on and so forth, grievances. So these are the two things I actually lead with, at least in the classroom as well as in public. And then finally, the rise in procedural cover to for content control. This is something I've been writing about, thinking about, talking about for many, 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 many years. It's not about this event. There is something in our bureaucracy that is basically the worshiping of procedures, and that is good when it actually applies to everyone equally, and it's really hurtful when it is not. Now we are seeing the latter part of it. My advice, including what we do here at over there at George Mason, yes, you do have to make some compromises, but not in your principles, but compromises in what you consider to be substantive. So on the one hand, you want to stick to procedures. people, students, groups, and so on that don't stick to procedures just because they're like, screw it, these are not fair, are not paying attention to what's likely to happen. So sticking to procedures, which is not too hard in most cases, and second, doing your homework and be proactive in what you do, from everything from booking rooms to figuring out the wording of things to inviting speakers and so on and so forth. I don't know if this answers the question, but the question of procedure cannot actually be dismissed. It's a very crucial question and requires strategizing to deal with it. Thank you.
Just very briefly, I guess I'll start where Bassam just ended. So to begin with, the time, place, manner restrictions are permissible, as I've already said. The first thing one needs to do on any campus is understand the campus's policies. If it's a public university, obviously those policies have to conform to the First Amendment. In private campuses, typically the speech codes and policies that predate October 7th claim to also be consistent with the First Amendment. So they voluntarily impose those same frames on themselves. You have to be familiar with those rules and comply with them. But once the rules start being changed on an ad hoc basis, which is what we've seen throughout the country since October 7th, what you need to insist on your campus is that there be no selective enforcement. You can't actually use the procedures to block particular content unless you're engaging in selective enforcement, because effectively what it would mean is you would also be silencing pro-Israel viewpoints or pro-Israel events, and that's not what's happening on campuses. And so you can immediately hoist them on their own petard, essentially, of proceduralism, which is to say a process or procedure is only as good, a rule is only as good as the way in which it's enforced. These campuses across the board have engaged in selective enforcement, which on their own terms is impermissible, and turn their own process language against them. On the data question, the challenge that we face is that there's no way to match the fire hose of false information that's being produced in the name of these claims around anti-Semitism that are dependent upon the conflations that we discussed. And so we have to first assess where we stand. We do not have the infrastructure to produce that kind of data if we wanted to. And even if we had the infrastructure, we face a structural constraint, which is the risk that people are exposed to when they engage in reporting and they are engaged in pro-Palestine activism and advocacy, which means internally, there's no way, even if we match the infrastructure, and I can speak after the panel about what that infrastructure looks like and why we don't have a comparable infrastructure in place and are unlikely to be able to reproduce it. Because of this, the actually best strategy to address data is to debunk the quality of the data that's being produced on the other side, which is garbage in, garbage out. They are soliciting information that is itself fundamentally flawed and does not conform to any meaningful definition of anti-Semitism, and then producing maps and statistics and grading systems and so forth that depend upon flawed data. And so that's really the best strategy. And then the question becomes, who is best placed to debunk that data? And there are a series of answers we can give to that, from computer science graduate students that we can work with as research assistants to faculty that are well mobilized and instructors that enable them to call into question some of these frames, such as, for example, the Faculty Council, Academic Council of Jewish Voice for Peace. And then lastly, on the framing point, the one thing I want to say is this iconography is so interesting to me because you might know that thousands of Turkish academics were purged and faced enormous constraints from 2015 forward after the Turkish president gave a speech in which he said terrorism by the pen is more dangerous than terrorism of the sword, by which he meant mobilizing ideas in the name of, in that case, advocating for Kurdish political rights. But here we can broaden it to Bassam's point, human rights is a general matter. The ideas of equality, ideas of self-determination, ideas of freedom represents a real threat to those who are committed to the suppression of those rights. And so really reframing in those kinds of terms and reminding all of us of the kind of authoritarianism that we're now witnessing on our campus, so that this is a threat not just to those who are advocates of Palestinian rights or other kinds of rights. We're talking about threats to the possibility of democratic speech in this country, to core ideas of citizenship. And I think that those, exceed any binary framing and frankly exceed the specifics of the conflict at the moment, notwithstanding the fact that we should all end where we began, which is that this is all unfolding against the backdrop of genocide. And that's the thing that has made it so acute, because to silence dissent, you have to go to far greater lengths to persuade people not to believe their lying eyes. And that means we have to silence in order to be able to continue to prevail in the propaganda war that we're all facing.
Thank you so much, Aslı. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm sure the panelists will agree to stick around for a little bit to chat some more. We will now take a 15-minute break and we'll reconvene here with the second panel at 11:10 sharp. So please drink some coffee and come back at 11:10 so we can continue with our full and exciting schedule. Thank you so much for everyone.